Well, welcome back. Our session today deals with participation and its contemporary relevance, metaphor, or metaphysics. Before we begin our session again this morning and have our presenters start, I would like to again express the Institute's great thanks to the John Templeton Foundation for their wonderful support of this colloquium. It is through a grant that they made to the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study that this last 3 days of events has been possible. The format for the session will be as follows. First, Douglas Hedley will offer an explanation of how the session plays a role in the larger issues that he's pursuing with regard to participation. Secondly, we'll have our two presenters, Cyril O'Regan, perfect timing, and Vittorio Hösle, present their thoughts on the topic of participation and contemporary relevance. They will be followed by Douglas Hedley, who will provide a brief response and commentary. The third and final component of this session will be the larger discussion of all the issues that they've put on the table. This will include an opportunity for you to ask questions or to make comments. We'll also have folks who are watching via the streaming live video. They may also have questions via the Colloquium blog. As you have questions or comments, please signal to me. I'll put you on the speakers list. And then when the microphone is passed to you, when I call on you, we ask you to do two things. First, identify yourself. And then secondly, when asking your question, please speak loudly. Our presenters this afternoon, or this morning, take your pick, are Cyril O'Regan, Vittorio Hösle, and Douglas Hedley. Cyril O'Regan is the Catherine F. Huisking Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. He specializes in systematic and historical theology with specific interests in the intersection of continental philosophy and theology, religion and literature, mystical theology, and postmodern thought. Professor O'Regan is the author of the Heterodox Hegel, Gnostic Return in Modernity, Gnostic Apocalypse, Jacob Boehm's Haunted Narrative, and Theology and the Spaces of Apocalyptic. The first volume of his two-volume work on Hans Urs von Balthasar, The Anatomy of Misremembering, Balthasar and Hegel, was recently published. The second volume, which features Balthasar and Heidegger, has been accepted for publication and is scheduled to be released in 2015. He is currently working on the third and fourth volumes of his project addressing the Gnostic Return, the former to focus on German idealism, and the latter to focus on Romanticism. Vittorio Hösle is the Paul Kimball Professor of Arts and Letters in the Department of German and Russian Languages and Literatures, and concurrent Professor of Philosophy and of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. His scholarly interests include the history of philosophy and systematic philosophy, including metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, and political theory. He is the author of more than 40 books in 20 languages, and these include Objective Idealism, Ethics and Politics, Morals and Politics, Woody Allen, An Essay on the Nature of the Comical, The Philosophical Dialogue, and 140 articles. His most widely published work, translated into 14 languages, is The Dead Philosopher's Cafe, an exchange of letters with a young girl that offers an imaginative introduction to the world of philosophy. From 2008 to 2013, he served as first director of the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. Douglas Hedley is reader in Hermeneutics and Metaphysics at the University of Cambridge and currently serves as a Templeton Fellow at the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. He specializes in Neoplatonism, the Cambridge Platonists, aspects of Romantic and Idealist thought, and philosophy of religion. His monographs include Sacrifice Imagined, Violence, Atonement, and the Sacred, Living Forms of the Imagination, and Aids to Reflection and the Mirror of the Spirit, Coleridge, Philosophy, and Religion. He is the principal investigator of a United Kingdom Arts and Humanities Council grant entitled Revisioning Cambridge Platonism, and he currently serves as co-chair of the Platonism, Neoplatonism group at the American Academy of Religion. Without further ado, I will turn the microphone over to Cyril O'Regan, Vittorio Hösle, and Douglas Hedley.
we have three terms: participation, metaphysics, and metaphor. And as is almost always the case, Kant provides a crux, sets the problem, points to a solution, and the solution is found either incomplete or entirely inadequate. And that is the story that I'm going to tell, despite the fact that Vittorio is alongside me. Let me start sort of with Kant and the destruction of metaphysics and the possibility of metaphor. I'm going to give this in a fairly bullet point form, as I think observations, that would be the modality of it. I take it that in the first critique, Kant is both himself and more than himself. That is, that there's a call for a referendum on metaphysics that has already happened, given the rise of empirical science. And the question has already been spawned, which he takes up: what kind of knowledge is possible in a world in which science works, or for which science works? The first critique gives the answer that if we're talking about knowledge in a strict sense, that is, if we're talking about the modality of theoretical reason, then we're talking about a synthetic a priori, and we're talking about the categories of understanding of a finite knower, as these categories are applied to the forms of space and time. Famously, the limits of knowledge equals the limits of our world. One cannot say that one gets in contact with the world as such, that is, the world as in itself. That is, noetic contact with the world is contact with the world of appearances. That is, that world explicable in terms of cause and effect. Now, this particular world of appearance is untethered from God as a cause of such a world. To speak of God as a cause of the whole order of appearance represents an equivocal use of the term cause, which has its domestic place within the phenomenal world between sort of a particular appearance and another appearance, and one is stipulating that one is the cause and the other is the effect. Of course, where this happens is in the transcendental dialectic, where, among other things, we have, though it has happened probably long before that, but where the coup de grace is delivered is in the transcendental dialectic, and we have the demolition of the proofs of God's existence. Now, in this particular world, that is the world of appearances, the world to which science gets, and the world to which we can validate knowledge, final causality is not an attributable feature of this particular world in which the synthetic a priori operates. One is not part of a whole, and part of a greater whole of which God and the world constitute the composite. One could say with respect, therefore, to the text, that is critique of pure reason, that we have the absence of the conditions of the possibility of participation. We cannot say that we come in contact with the real as such, and the system as such is not anchored in God as the really real. We could have the ghost of Heidegger's ontotheology. That is, ontotheology, whether in Heideggerian or sort of in the Kantian sense, is dismissed. Now, we wouldn't want to make Kant the prime originator of a particular view or the waving goodbye sort of to metaphysics and participation. I've already said so that this refusal is performed in the rise of empirical science or empirical science. And in terms of history, of course, we could say that the first refusal has happened in the late medieval period in nominalism. Now, I don't want to get into the story of predation of nominalism always being the bad thing and so forth, but suppose that for the moment I resort to cliche. We can say so that, minimally at least, that nominalism is against universals, and universals have sort of being the happy campers with participation. There may not sort of be the sufficient conditions of participation, but clearly necessary conditions. And that necessary condition so no longer applies. That is, the mind knows only singulars. It does not know the universals within which singulars are supposed to adhere. But of course, we also have a second issue, a second way sort of in which participation gets embarrassed, shall we say, or is rendered inoperative. And that is, of course, that there is a God. And this God does not function as the authorization with respect to a world of reason which we human beings can share with God. We have a voluntarist God. And this voluntarist God sort of has a relationship which is not obliging on him, whereby sort of God relates to the world in a way so that is rule governed, but only to the degree to which God decides that it's rule governed, and God sort of could undo that decision. So we have the famous distinction between potentia absoluta and potentia ordinata. But back to the story of Kant. Given sort of that I have a brief time, I'm going to stipulate the following. I can imagine a good Kantian arguing that what Kant has lost entirely in the Critique of Pure Reason, he gets back more or less entirely in the Critique of Practical Reason. And that is, if our issue is participation, then sort of one can imagine sort of that there's participation in the order of freedom, given sort of that Kant would want to say that there's something about human beings that are not determined by cause and effect. I'm going to stipulate for the moment so that it has all kinds of problems, and sort of Kant is not going to get back what he has sort of given away sort of in the first critique. It may very well be so that Vittorio will want to address this issue. What I do want to suggest is, though, that if we get to the third critique, things get a little bit more interesting. And that is that the teleology and wholeness which were denied by the first critique, or rendered inoperative, denial sort of is too strong a term, in the third critique is regarded as inevitable. Human beings are going to, simply as a matter of fact, are going sort of to have intuitions of teleology in nature and so forth. And to this extent, we could say that it's coming in the back door. But of course, Kant sort of is also quite consistent. We can't intellectually validate it. So teleology is something so that we find irresistible, but at the same time, we can't intellectually validate it. It's as if we want sort of to think about something like final causality in the mode no longer as if. It's not as if. It is we look at the world and read the world as the world. As the world is teleological. And if we read the world as teleological, then that means sort of that we're reading metaphorically. Metaphor is now coming in, and it's coming in sort of in and through aesthetics. I said I'm telling a story. So far I told no story. So I've given you two contexts, and I've allied it sort of the Critique of Practical Reason. What I want to do sort of is talk about two relatively similar but somewhat different responses. And that is the responses of German idealism, which I'm taking to be a response. That is, it refigures Kant. It doesn't simply continue Kant by other means. And Romanticism, which obviously sort of is post-Kantian to a significant extent. And that will be the case sort of in Germany and or also, I think, in Great Britain because of Coleridge. I've mentioned Coleridge again, and I'm probably going to do so in due course again. Now, I don't want to talk about Hegel, simply because I'm tired of talking about Hegel, so I'm going to talk about Schelling. And I want to talk in particular sort of about Schelling, the Schelling of the system of transcendental idealism, which I think we can take to be sort of a idealist text, and because Schelling changes his mind and changes his mind again and again, so if we're talking about Schelling of 1809, sort of it's not the Schelling of 1804, and maybe 1804 is not the same as 1799, etc. But these niceties are things sort of I'm going to dismiss. We can assume sort of that a German idealist like Schelling is interested in looking at the world as a whole. That is, in line sort of with Kant's third critique. That somehow or other sort of there's a way in which sort of we want to talk about knowledge as knowledge sort of the whole, and knowledge sort of as a part, that the part is in the whole of which it has knowledge of. Now, again, I don't want to talk about sort of what is the ground moment of the identity, sort of the subjective and objective in Schelling. Just simply want to state that as the system of transcendental idealism develops, Schelling will want to claim that all nature and all mind participates in the one. And this one, of course, is not the personal God. Participation is real. And unlike Kant of the third critique, it is not in the mode of as. It is not a metaphor. We're talking about a non-conceptual grasp of the whole. And at least in this text, Kant is denying what Hegel would in due course affirm. That is, that we can have a conceptual grasp of the whole. I take it that's the major difference between sort of these two protagonists. The non-conceptual grasp of the whole is the highest form of participation. One can participate in the unity of subject-object, which is presupposed in all cognition, or one sort of can get to the indifference point, whichever sort of particular locution, depending on the text. What is interesting about this text, and this is, I think, probably the major point that I would want to recommend, not necessarily assert, is that in this text, unlike sort of other texts, particularly texts by Hegel, this cognition, shall we say, discursive cognition, is regarded as the peculiar property of art, and not the peculiar property necessarily of philosophy. Hegel will change, rather, Schelling will change his mind on this. But this particular text is extraordinarily interesting, and obviously sort of it is secreted by Romanticism. The symbol, the artistic symbol, represents a condensation of the whole as the whole sort of is contracted into a fragment. The symbol is not a metaphor in the strict sense, because a symbol gives you contact with reality as such, even if it doesn't give you mastery. The difference between at least the early Hegel and the early Schelling is, I think, fairly obvious here. At least by 1802, Hegel would have decided, though early on sort of things are in more flux, that artistic and religious discourses do in fact have a measure of participation. And they have a measure of participation insofar as those discourses can, again, form condensations or condensing sort of the whole in the part. But those belong to lower order discourses. And the lower order discourse is not that there's not participation. It has got to do with intensities of participation. So it seems to me that there is a significant contrast between the early Schelling, at least, and Hegel as Hegel evolves. This is also brought out sort of in the notion of genius. The genius is he or she who is beyond self-reflection. The symbol means more than he or she can say, or he and she meant. There is a semantic surplus. And of course, if Schelling is thinking of this, he's thinking of Goethe and he's thinking of Schiller, and he might have, but perhaps did not, also think of Novalis and his friend Hösle. There's much more to say, but I want to make a suggestion about how in particular, given sort of what we have been talking about in this conference, how in particular, particularly in Schelling, there is an appeal to the ancestry of Neoplatonism. It doesn't, I think, demand a fantastic amount of demonstration that Plotinus and Proclus were important for Schelling. It also turns out that the modern figure, Giordano Bruno, died in 1600, is an incredibly important figure as the transmitter sort of Neoplatonic wisdom. The Bruno text, I think, dates from 1804. And Bruno is a philosophical revolutionary, and to some extent, what Schelling is doing is what Kant had done. Bruno sort of is you're coating yourself or clothing yourself in a revolutionary figure, because he was a revolutionary figure in the way that Kant clothed himself in Copernicus. Bruno is an exemplar of Neoplatonism which is insistent on participation. And this form of participation clearly sort of is the most resolute, comprehensive, and we could say sort of saturated form of participation you can imagine. Presumably Aristotle has a version of participation, but clearly it's not of the same as this. To be sort of the most assertive and to provide the most assertive, and this is Schelling's sort of reprise, of participation is to provide sort of the most assertive form of Platonism, at least as this text sort of moves on. And what this will mean, of course, is that, among other things, we have to necessarily remove all traces of duality in the divine-world relationship. The Neoplatonic view of the divine, the standard view is, in a divine-world relationship, the effect remains in the cause, right? Not cut off from the cause. And this, of course, in principle, involves a tension, which Christians tend to master, but it does involve an essential tension between the Christian view of the creator-created distinction, and Christian Neoplatonists can be divided as to how successful they sort of deal with this particular tension. But Bruno has a particular modern modification, which is taken up by Schelling. That is, it's not just simply that the effect remains in the cause. It is that the cause is fully exhausted in the effect. So that, in this sense, it seems to me the terms for German idealism as a whole, and also defines to some extent at least sort of Hegel's project with respect to the divine-world relation. There is no excess of virtuality or possibility in the cause that is not in fact rendered sort of in the effect. And this sort of seems to be sort of a form of Neoplatonism now which is not really in tension with sort of Christian tradition, but clearly sort of is antithetical to it. Now, the case sort of Schelling's relation to Christianity is extraordinarily tormented and tortured, and he's going to become sort of much more nearly a Christian sort of after 1804 and so forth. But the text I'm talking about is 1804. And this text means that Christianity is regarded as holding up sort of a duality between sort of the world and God over the world. And to have a duality of the world and God means, of course, that God has a world, but God has the world that God has decided to have, no more than that, no less than that. I want to just move back briefly to what's suggested in terms of art in system of transcendental idealism. Schelling is partly granting what Hösle is suggesting. That is, if we're going to have participation in a world in which participation does not seem to be capable of being philosophically indemnified, then the question becomes who or what is going to be the custodian of it, to the degree to which you commit it to it. And I want to suggest that one indication clearly stated sort of by Hösle and somewhat stated by Schelling is that the custodianship of participation has migrated from philosophy to art. But coming with that then means that you also are committed that experiences of participation are exceptional rather than the rule. Philosophy sort of may be a hieratic discourse, and maybe they may in fact be throughout the tradition, and certainly Neoplatonism, the discourse of the exceptional person. But in principle, philosophy is democratic. It now looks that not merely do we have migration, but the migration sort of is the migration to the exception, and that participation is that which can be grasped in an epiphanic moment, and epiphanic moments sort of are what is going to define artworks as such, and even artists are not always going to be sort of in that particular modality. I'm going to end sort of by some brief comments about English Romanticism and the fate sort of our participation, and sort of know what are its constraints and who is custodian of it. I was going to talk about Heidegger and so forth, but we're under sort of, I think, some degree of temporal kind of histrionic here, so we'll leave that out. I take it that in English Romanticism, that the epistemological turn is not called back. So whatever form of participation we're talking about, whatever orientation, etc., so if the epistemic subjects are still going to be fairly highly valorized. And if we have participation and if we have objectivity sort of this really real sort, that's sort of going to be the objective correlative sort of certain kinds of subjective act. The epistemology, of course, is deliberately anti-empiricist. So we don't need to, I think, rehearse the examples. I think Wordsworth would be a performative example. Blake sort of would be an ideological and performative example, etc. And I'll get to Coleridge momentarily. It's also the case, and interestingly the case, that in English Romanticism, Neoplatonism is everywhere. And it's not there simply by inference, that we can read also certain terms, a kind of anima mundi, let's say, sort of from the prelude and so forth. It's there sort of as a kind sort of ideological baggage. That is, Blake, for instance, self-consciously recalls Platonism and Neoplatonism, and the power of imagination in poetry to redress what he thinks sort of is catastrophe of modernity, for which he's going to blame sort of Newton and Locke and Bacon. So it's perfectly clear sort of that the ideological battle and the poetry, the major poetry, is in fact the scene of the battle. It's an ideological battle. The image or symbol is superior to concept in locking into the real and thus participating in it. In other words, discursive reason, and the only discursive reason sort of that he is thinking of is he's thinking sort of empiricist-laced discourse, which he thinks sort of does not get you to the real at all. It gets you operationally sufficient, but no more than that. Philosophical discourse, at least by implication on this view, does not have the power to participate at all. Poetry supplies the function once served by philosophy. It charts a world of interconnectedness whose wholeness is worth corresponding to and is in fact corresponded to in ecstatic moments of witness and expression. The knower as well as the known. Not only what is known sort of is a part of participation, but the knower participates in the very act of knowledge, in sort of that which is, or that which is whole, that sort of which is alive, and that sort of which is worthy and good. In the symbol, a divine world, not otherwise specified, shines through the undivine world so that is. I've indicated sort of that recall of Platonism is fairly systemic in English Romanticism, and I think that's sort of also the case in Coleridge. I think I probably will not try to demonstrate it. What I can sort of try and recall is that imagination, which of course is productive rather than reproductive, and we'll leave aside sort of that much of what he writes about imagination is cribbed, in fact, sort of from system of transcendental idealism, from which I sort of talked about momentarily. But we have all the standard romantic tropes. That is, if we are talking about participation, and we are talking about symbol, and we are talking about poetry obviously sort of a particular high excellent sort, that is the kind of sort that you might find in Wordsworth, you might find in William Shakespeare, then we're talking about genius. And genius, of course, is exceptional. And then in the exception, that is the person who has the ability sort of to look into things and participate, even then, not all moments of grasp, shall we say, are moments of participation, because only in peak moments do you actually have participation. So now we have exceptionality within exceptionality, nonetheless governed by a new discourse, that is, what sort of is not going to be served by philosophy any longer will be served sort of by another discourse, as I say, the migration. The participation is beyond the precincts of the God of Christianity. I have a very strong unsentimental streak. I'm a theologian. But when I sort of look at things which do not agree with my theology, I simply say they don't agree. So English Romanticism sort of is certainly discourse of the divine. It's not at the same time the discourse with respect to the Christian God. It is true that the English Romantics, by and large, and so we're simply giving you nominations at the moment as to who they are. We can add Shelley, I suppose. They're all against a purely mechanistic view of the world. And, of course, they want to assert an alternative. And language has, I suppose in principle, and in fact in poetry, language sort of has a non-discursive power and a non-discursive power of attachment sort of to the whole and the rendering of that whole. There are, I think, in the English Romantics, different degrees of ontological commitment. I take it, for instance, that when Blake sort of is thinking about sort of our participation in the whole, it's totally unironic. That is, there is not a trace of metaphor distanciation. It's not that we are looking at the world as the world is this way. Most certainly not looking at the world as if the world is this way. We are locking into the world in the most realistic sense possible. The ontological commitment with respect to a symbol and myth is pretty absolute. It might not be quite as absolute, however, in Shelley, for instance. So maybe we might be talking sort of about a participation index which has some modest note sort of a distanciation, not quite metaphor, not quite is and is not, but nonetheless sort of not quite sort of thickly sort of there as in Blake. The divine in Romanticism is in. The biblical God is out, for obvious reasons. No romantic, or precisely as romantic, keeps the biblical God intact. It doesn't keep the biblical God intact for any number of reasons, which are fairly obvious. This God is a God transcendent with respect to the world, who exercises power over the world, who acts volitional disposition of the world. What God sort of wants to do, God sort of will do. Romanticism, English Romanticism, stipulates the Enlightenment critique of God. And then thinks, of course, the Enlightenment itself is a disaster in terms sort of its collusion sort of with science, its collusion with technology, and so forth. And we need sort of a humane alternative which has divinity sort of as part of things, has wholeness as part of things, or has wholeness at least as the almost human possibility. But most certainly not the biblical God. The biblical God allowed certain forms of participation, and those forms of participation on these terms, romantic terms, were participation by best courtesy. That is, that if the duality between the world and God actually really allowed it. Platonism does not go with Christianity in this instance. That is, the tension sort of is such, from a romantic point of view, that you can peel off, you have to peel off Platonism. And Platonism now, as transposed, is transposed sort of into a new and much more imminent key, which means that the biblical God is long, long gone, or at least hopefully long, long gone. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to this fascinating conference. It's a great pleasure to be back at the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. I have only some general reflections of a philosopher on the concept of participation. I do not sketch a history as detailed and fascinating as that sketched by Cyril, but I focus on some important issues in the formulation of a project of participation. Certainly, we must begin with one quite obvious fact. In modern discourse among analytical philosophers, participation is not in. It is not a concept that enjoys great importance. What instead is used is a concept of instantiation. When I say what Plato would say, all persons in this room participate in the idea of humanity, we would simply say, well, there are different instantiations of the property of humankind. Where does the Platonic idea start from? Obviously, Plato, basic motive for the introduction of the ideas is to guarantee the intelligibility of being. We happen to cognize the world by subsuming individuals, and Plato is not really concerned in the very important task on how we are able to re-identify particulars, but after having re-identified a particular, we cognize it by subsuming it under general concepts. And for Plato, this is the reason why we have assumed that there is a world of universals. What are the problems of a Platonic doctrine that have often been pointed out by analytical philosopher? First of all, Plato uses to predicate the ideas of themselves. And that seems absurd. It is clearly so that horses neigh and have 4 legs, but it's not very reasonable to assume that the concept of a horse has 4 legs, because concepts don't have legs. Concepts do not neigh. So when Plato seems to say that the concept of greatness, of largeness is large, we have difficulties to understand why the concept of largeness should be larger than the concept of smallness. All this seems to be relatively absurd. One way of making sense of it has been simply to say that Plato uses these predications in a Pauline sense, like when the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 13, we say love is enduring, patient, and so on. Obviously, what is meant is that loving people are enduring, patient, and so on. Love itself is hardly to be understood as enduring. And one very important distinction that has been done in the late 19th century by Frege is the distinction between conceptual traits and properties of concept. And many people think that Plato confused the 2 aspects. Let me give you an example that Frege himself uses. If I have 4 noble horses, noble horses are the trait of the concept, are traits of the concept. The concept noble horse is the trait of being a horse, and then of being a mammal, etc., and of being noble. But 4 cannot be a trait of the concept, a noble horse. It is a property of this concept that it is instantiated in 4 exemplars. And the confusion of traits of concepts and properties of concepts is a major issue of philosophical absurdities. And many people have rightly argued that a lot of the participation discourse suffers from that. The second problem that analytical philosophers find in the ideas is that The concepts, the ideas in Plato are sometimes simple properties, universal properties, and normative ideals. Phil Sloan, in his fascinating paper this morning, insisted on this Kantian passage in which Kant insists that insists on the normative power, of the archetypal power of the Platonic ideas. Certainly there are such ideas in Plato, the idea of virtue, the idea of goodness, but there are other passages where he seems to mean by ideas simple, also descriptive universals. The third problem is, of course, the epistemological issue. How do we get to universals? And an empiricist strand would simply say that we grasp universals through the experience of real objects, that there is no other way. I would not develop the concept of horseness if I had never encountered individual horses. That is a large strand of anti-Platonicism in the empirical world, and one has to say that the greatest and most precise reconstruction of Platon's ideas in the early 20th century, Husserl's in the second logical investigation, is in many aspects empiricistic. I mean, also Husserl is convinced that there are universals, but we get at the universals only through the experience of individual objects. The problem is, of course, does this hold of all concepts, or are there certain concepts where even if psychologically we may have been motivated to conceive them through individual experiences, there is no way of linking them to empirical events. And mathematical objects, aesthetical and ethical concepts have been mentioned by Carl in his great paper this morning as an example of going beyond that. And finally, there is the big problem that the ancient and also the medieval metaphysics up to Thomas Aquinas doesn't have any concepts of possible worlds. Now, the concept of possible world is a very difficult concept, and we can say that the logic of that was only grasped in the middle of the 20th century. And modal logic is tough. To be precise, when you speak about possible objects, is something which requires a long training. And in the ancient world, the concept of possibility is an intramundane concept of possibility. Think of Aristotle. The bud is potentially a tree. Yeah, or the bud is potentially a flower, it will become a flower. But of course, he speaks about flowers within the world. The idea that there are possible worlds with completely different laws of nature is alien to the ancient world. And it is only developed in the late 13th century in context of complex theological discussions. Now, all these arguments, I think, are relatively strong reasons why the participation discourse has suffered. One has, however, to say, with regard to Plato, that Plato alludes to some of the issues in his late dialogues and in the so-called unwritten doctrine. In the Parmenides, for example, there is a very important differentiation among four types of idea. Here, the logical ideas are distinguished from the ethical and aesthetical ideas, and those are distinguished from ideas of, let's say, horses, and then these are distinguished from ideas of bad things like filth. And this seems to be an attempt to render justice to the issues I was mentioning before. Second, Plato, in my eyes, rightly understood that there are some ideas that are not wrongly predicated of themselves. As I said before, it is silly to say the idea of largeness is large. But it certainly makes sense to say the idea of being is, or the concept of a concept is itself a concept. You can also use relations, like, for example, the idea of identity is identical with itself. There is nothing wrong in that. And if you look at how Plato uses self-predication of ideas in his later dialogues, he does it quite well and intelligently. So Plato seems to have recognized that the self-predication of ideas is appropriate in some cases, but not in all cases. And one of the major issues, of course, in the doctrine of ideas is how you can demarcate the two types of ideas where self-predication is possible and self-predication is not possible. And in the unwritten doctrine, we have finally an attempt to give an a priori account of the generation of the ideas. This is linked to the very important task in the Platonic Academy to give foundations of mathematics. I mean, the discussion on the foundations of mathematics in the Platonic Academy had a level that was achieved only in the course of the 19th century. It's almost unbelievable how good they were. In this context, Plato has the idea that unity and the illimited dyad are the general principles of the cosmos of the ideas. However, he does not really give us a deduction of ideas. He only tries to show that concrete ideas can be reduced to these two principles. In a process of induction, how you go down, it's simply not clear. Finally, Plato has a very important distinction that is often overlooked when we identify the ideas with any universal property. Plato distinguishes in the Statesman between eide and mere. He says, well, like a good cook has to cut at the joints of the animal that he's preparing, so a good philosopher has to find the eide and not simply the mere. What does Plato mean by that? Well, he means, of course, that there are natural kinds, and that not all types of classification are equally intelligent, which is obvious. I mean, a biologist usually tries to give a taxonomy that is more complex than classifying animals according to the colors. The distinction between vertebrates and invertebrates seems to capture more of the essence of life than the classification of animals whether they are blue or non-blue. Why? They are both, in both cases we use concepts, but in this case we seem to come closer to the entity. And we should not forget that the classification of in botany and zoology begins in the academy. Spusip, Plato's nephew and successor in the academy, wrote the Homoia, which was the first attempt of taxonomy of the living world, and of course Aristotle continues that in his great biological writings. So clearly, whenever you are interested in the issue of natural kinds, the problem of finding the right ideas comes there, and of course in the case of organisms there is some form of normativity in which it makes sense to say, well, this animal, for example, is a bad instantiation of a species. Partly it may be a misfit, partly it may be sick or weak, it's not able to fulfill the normal functions of the organisms. So there seems to be already in the case of organisms, and even more, of course, in the case of humans, the problem of instantiations that do not really get up to the level of the idea. And this leads us now to the problem of a participation in God. For Plato, the ideas are nothing physical and also nothing mental, as he says in the first part of the Parmenides. However, in the Sophist, he tries to argue that they are correlated to a mind, not our individual mind, but something like a divine mind. It's not completely clear and elaborated. And probably already in Middle Platonism, but certainly Neoplatonism, we have then a very elaborate doctrine of a divine mind as being the subjective correlate of the ideas that are thought by God. And now we understand immediately that the participation in the ideas that exist in the divine mind subsists on two different levels. On the one hand, we can simply say that everything which is, insofar as it can be categorized by a universal and even by a special kind to which it belongs, is an instantiation of one of the divine ideas. And secondly, and this has to be distinguished, of course, there is a participation in God, not in the sense that every object instantiates some of the divine ideas, but that we participate in the divine grasping of the world, in the thinking of the ideas. And obviously in this context, we come to the idea that the philosophical life, the contemplative life, by which we grasp the world in its natural kinds, is the ultimate homoiosis toteo. And this would then be a philosophical activity. Now, Plato was the greatest artist-philosopher ever, but I think he is much closer to Hegel than to Schelling in his belief that, of course, the ultimate authority is in philosophy. It's philosophy that has to decide what is good art. Art in itself may be very attractive, but art is subject to philosophical scrutiny, and I think this is a very reasonable point of view. Therefore, I do think that, in fact, Hegel is much closer to Plato than Schelling. Now, in a certain sense, the fact that everything participates in an idea is true, but it's trivially true. everything which is, for example, participates in the idea of being insofar as it instantiates being. And one of the major tasks of this tradition has been to find out the concrete steps that exist between the mere being and between our intellect, which, as we said before, participates in the divine act of thinking. And early on, the tradition of participation developed the idea of a scala naturae, already in the Platonic Timaeus. There is, I mean, he doesn't use the term, but the concept is there, like the vegetative or the sensitive soul are somehow between the inorganic entities and the intellective soul. And connected with this idea is also the other, that the world tries to offer as many intermediate steps as possible. That's a famous principle of plenitude, which plays a very important role in this tradition. Now, I do think that in the context of this tradition, there have been several extremely important changes. And the one is, of course, that given by Leibniz. Why is Leibniz so important in this tradition? Of course, on the one hand, Leibniz is familiar with the metaphysics of possible worlds that was developed in the late Middle Ages. Leibniz already as a child was reading large scholastic volumes in Latin. I mean, he had this wunderkind attitude in early on. He was familiar with the metaphysics of possible world. And his central idea is that we need an account in order to make sense of God's will, of God's choosing of various possible worlds, which we do not really have in the Platonic and Neoplatonic tradition because they don't have a metaphysics of possible world. And again, it's, to give a logic of that, is quite hard and difficult. Problems solved very late. On the other hand, Leibniz is a rationalist, and he thinks that among the many, many possible worlds, God, being a perfect being, has to choose the best possible world. He doesn't have a good argument why there is only one world with maximal value. This he more or less presupposes, and it was early on understood as a major issue of his problem. Even the young Kant tried to defend the unicity of the best possible world. Later became very skeptical with regard to that. But Leibniz believes that if God is really perfectly well, he could only choose at least a world with maximal value. And by doing so, of course, he increases the theodicy problem considerably, because it would be sufficient to show that this world is not the best possible world in order to show that God cannot exist. And in fact, Aquinas denies that we live in the best possible world because he thinks there is no world with maximal value. The problem of the Aquinas possibility is that there is no way whatsoever, if you deny that there is a best possible world, to explain why God creates one world and not another. Because since there's an infinite series of worlds with ever-increasing value, wherever you stop, there is an infinite amount beyond. And therefore, there is simply no way whatsoever to make any connection between God and the world. And therefore, even if Aquinas is not a voluntarist, in fact, the incapacity of solving the issue of relation between God and the world is a very, very serious threat to it. And my point is that once you have a metaphysics of possible worlds, the Leibnizian way is the only reasonable way of making sense of the idea that the world manifests value. I mean, the other important aspect that Leibniz inherits from the philosophy of his time is, of course, the Cartesian revolution, the distinction between mental and physical predicates, which is also completely alien to the ancient and the medieval world. The fact that it's impossible to identify mental states with physical states, his famous example with Mill. If I could walk in a brain that was as big as a mill, I would learn a lot of things, but I could never identify the various physical, or to modern language, electrochemical states that I find in your brain with correlating mental states, because the two things are not identical. And the other aspect is that he inherits from Spinoza the metaphysics of laws of nature. He thinks that a causal explanation is indeed a causal explanation, like Carl explained this morning, that has to be done by antecedent conditions and natural laws. However, the big difference between Leibniz and Spinoza is that Leibniz thinks that you have to give an account for how the laws of nature are what they are. And this is a final account. Finalism in the final causes in Leibniz do not come in by challenging the account of efficient causes. It's not so that we have holes in the account of efficient causes. Leibniz is as determinist as you can be, and of course also compatibilist with regard to the problem of human freedom. But he thinks that the system of natural laws has been chosen by God among a great variety of possible systems of natural laws in order to maximize value. That is where finality comes in. And therefore, Leibniz metaphysics is completely in tune with what you call methodological naturalists today. And it's not simply in tune. I mean, Leibniz is one of the greatest creators of the modern science. I mean, his contributions to mathematics are absolutely stellar. And also his contributions to physics are very, very important. And one of the big criteria for God is the simplicity and fertility of the natural laws. And of course, this is then his answer to the theodicy issue. Why does God allow for the enormous amount of suffering that we see in the world? Well, the maximizing of happiness is not his only criterion. Otherwise, we would live in a different world. And it's quite naive to say that we live in a world in which happiness is maximized. There are quite a lot of unhappy and suffering persons. But according to Leibniz, God wants to maximize happiness in a way that renders it compatible with the simplicity of natural laws. And since the simplicity of natural laws entails that if a heavy object falls on your skull, it will break your skull, he accepts that, even if this brings a lot of pain, not necessarily to the person who immediately dies, but to the relatives. The second great change in this discussion is German idealism, and here already Cyril has said a lot, so I don't want to add much, but I want to mention two issues that, in my eyes, are extremely important in the German idealist reformulation of participation. Well, I think that Cyril is right in saying that the German idealist, and in many aspects the romantic version, and I agree with you, Cyril, that romanticism is a deeply post-Enlightenment movement. Obviously, the whole romantic sensibility is only possible after Enlightenment, is based on accepting as more or less evident the great discovery of the 18th century of the historical world. The modern natural sciences were created in the 17th century, the modern social sciences and humanities fundamentally in the 18th century. And in this context, people became aware that there's not such a thing as the biblical God. There are very different concepts of God in very different books of the Bible. There is not a thing as a Christology of the Gospels. The Christology of Mark and the Christology of John are completely different. These are facts that became obvious to the educated person in the late 18th century. And in this context, it became more and more difficult to simply regard the tradition as the ultimate criterion. At the same time, German idealism tries to develop a system of Ede, and here they use a method of dialectic that is not completely different from what Plato in his unwritten doctrine wanted to do. In Plato, the two principles that work together are the one and the dyad, while in German idealism it's subject and object. This has to do with the Cartesian revolt that has occurred in the time. And it is much, much more subtle and concrete in the elaboration of the systems of the basic natural kinds of the world. Obviously, the ultimate end is the grasping of a principle of the universe, of the divine principles in the human mind. And certainly in German idealism, the negative plays an important role. It is a moment, but you have to have it, and this is also used then in the answer to the theodicy issue. My time is running out. In fact, I had still another part of almost equal length in which I wanted to answer your general questions. How much do I still have?
We have time. We have time.
We have still time?
Yep.
So I can and now try to answer. I don't know, Douglas, whether the paper that you sent us was also sent to the participants of the conference. You sent us a few weeks.
Yes,
so everybody knows your
yep.
list of questions. And I wanted to try to answer some of the questions, not all of them, that you sent us, because I thought that this was part of our debate. One of the questions that Douglas was asking is there a full doctrine of creation in the Platonic, Neoplatonic sources, or merely what Reale calls semi-creationismo? And the answer is, well, obviously, first of all, in Plato's Timaeus, the creation is not in time. Why not? Well, because time is itself created. Since time is itself one of the things created, it follows immediately that the creation cannot be in time. Now, this does not necessarily entail that the time that has flown till the moment of now has to be infinite, but it doesn't exclude it either. So this with regard to the first issue. And in fact, Aquinas himself teaches that it can only be held by revelation that the time that has passed is finite, while he obviously thinks that it's held by reason that the world is created. Second, Plato does not seem to believe that the hora, this space matter, is created. It is anterior to the act of creation that changes in German idealism insofar as, for example, in the philosophy of nature of Hegel, space and matter are themselves concepts that are developed after the logical. And in fact, the decisive difference that we have in the Hegelian system between logical categories and categories of philosophy, of real philosophy, what he calls real philosophy, philosophy of nature, and philosophy of mind, is that only the logical categories are self-referential, can be predicated of themselves, I should better say. And then the other and big issue is, of course, but what is the state of the ideas? How does the demiurge relate to the ideas? And this leads us to a very important issue, the problem of the euthyphron. An early Platonic dialogue in which Plato already addresses the issue, is something good because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it is good? The dialogue ends aporetically, but it's one of his apparent aporias. Everybody who knows Plato a little bit knows that Plato clearly thinks that the gods love something because it is good, that voluntarism would lead to monstrous ideas, that something would become good only because God orders it. And here Leibniz, who follows the Platonic tradition, has in my eyes the most striking arguments against any form of religious voluntarism, that if something is good because God orders it, then if we have a dualist system between God and the devil happens to supplant God, then, of course, what he orders would become good. So the idea that might makes right is a quite repellent idea. And I personally do not think, I do think that religious metaphysical convictions are a very, very strong support of our moral ideas, but I'm afraid that voluntarism is one of the doctrines that makes people morally worse than even atheists usually are. Because it renders the idea of goodness dependent on the idea of power. Of course, then this leads to a problem of the necessity and freedom of creation. And here, the answers that, for example, both Leibniz and Hegel would give is that there is such a thing as a moral necessity in the creation. There is a choice in Leibniz, not in Hegel, because unfortunately Hegel doesn't have a metaphysics of possible world. It's completely missing in German idealism, which is surprising since it had been elaborated a time ago, but we didn't have the logical resources to construct it. So there is a moment of choice, but the choice is for the good. And in fact, this is based on a norm, on my eyes, completely rational concept of freedom. Free is not the person who can do whatever he or she wants. Free is the person who decides to act morally. That is the ultimate source of freedom, and the freedom that entails the liberum arbitrium indifferentiae, even containing the possibility of giving in to evil, is an idea quite irreligious and incompatible with the awe that we owe to the concept of God. Another question that Doug was asking is not evolution in contrast with the concept of emanation that is often connected with participation model? And here the answer is that this is also one of the enormous achievements of German idealism. The German idealism has a metaphysics in many aspects akin to Platonism, but in which evolution plays an enormous role. Because, as I said before, in the Hegelian system, we have this realm of logic, which is anterior, in the language of Hegel, to the creation of the world. It is subsistent, and the idea of good belongs to this realm. But then there is a manifestation of the divine, first in nature and then in spirit. Spirit develops out of nature. That's very different from the Plotinian model, where the nous and the psyche are before nature. However, Hegel's account is, of course, a theological account. Nature has to be structured in such a way, the laws have to be determined in such a way that they necessarily bring forth a mentality and moral beings that are social, that are able to interact morally with each other. Is this a form of pantheism? Also one of Douglas' questions. Well, I mean, on the one hand, there is the distinction between pantheism and panentheism. But everything is in God is obvious. If God is all-knowing, everything must be represented in God. And if we assume an idea of participation, of course, it's not so that not only so that everything is in God, but God, in obviously not a spatial sense, is present in everything. Otherwise, it could not be. But what is crucial is to avoid a form of pantheism that destroys the difference between good and evil. And that is, of course, the reason why in the 17th and 18th century, Spinoza was regarded as the devil of Christian theology, because Spinoza's metaphysics is fundamentally an amoral pantheism. God is present everywhere, in Auschwitz and in the acts of love of Mother Teresa. All is expression of the divine omnipotence. And that is profoundly disturbing. And one of the great achievements of Leibniz is that by going back to the doctrine of permitting evil that we find, for example, in Aquinas, he insists that the evil that we see in the world is only accepted as a means to achieve higher ends, but that it would be absurd to say that God wills evil in the same degree as he wills good, even if it is correct, according to Leibniz, that anything that happens has to be willed by God. Therefore, even events are willed by God. They are willed as means to something else, not in themselves. And therefore, we would need a doctrine of different degrees of God's presence in the world. There are states that are axiologically higher. This leads then to the other question of Doug: how does the doctrine of participation, is it inextricably linked, you're right, to unacceptable political theories of hierarchy, mirroring the cosmic gradatio entis? And again, I think that one of the best answers to this question is Hegel's philosophy of right, because Hegel's philosophy of right, on the one hand, accepts an hierarchy of social institutions, family, civil society, state, and the whole story is much more complex than that. In the, but I give only the last part of philosophy of right, the Sittlichkeit. But at the same time, Hegel embraces the 18th century revolution in ethics that leads to the idea of basic human rights. Hegel was, for example, a staunch opponent of slavery, while one of the most depressing things about the late Schelling is that he defended even the slave trade, not only slavery, but the slave trade. He said that was the only way to have these people Christianized. And the fact that so many died is nothing to the fact that all these black people have been, that some of them have been Christianized by being brought to America. I mean, that is quite horrifying. That is not Hegel's very, very clear commitment to universal human rights. After all, for him, the French Revolution was a very important event, even if nobody analyzed the self-destructive tendencies of this revolution as precisely as he did. Now, let me end with last two questions. Doug asks us, does the idea of absolute plenitude diminish the sense of human creativity? Well, of course, if you believe that God is omnipotent, then human creativity is not something against God. It is inevitable to quote, we don't know where he has it, but to use, like Goethe says in the fourth part of Dichtung und Wahrheit, nihil contra Deum, nisi Deus ipse. And obviously, nihil creatum, nisi Deo ipso adjutante, at least. So creativity cannot really exist if you believe in an omnipotent God, because the ultimate creator is there, and you only participate in his creativity by, of course, creating things that have not existed before. But even if nobody would deny that Don Quixote was created by Cervantes, it is still so that you have to assume that there is a possible world in which Don Quixote exists. I do not think that there is any way in the metaphysics of literature to solve the reference problem if you do not assume that there are possible worlds to which literary works refer. And of course, possible worlds are not created by us. They are there. We discover them. So ultimately, yes, I would agree, the doctrine destroys creativity in a radical sense. And finally, the last question, well, but does this not destroy the idea of God as person? Does it not lead to God as an impersonal being? Well, here my answer is that certainly God is not a person in our sense. For one simple reason, that the only way how we can make sense of personhood is that we are temporal beings. Our basic aspect of what we are in our mental life is our temporality. And I do not think, and here I'm in absolute agreement with the overwhelming part of the tradition, that God is a temporal being. And therefore, he cannot have memory, for example, because memory makes only sense when you are referring to something which is a past to you. But for God, there is no past. In fact, Aquinas insists that God cannot hope. It's absurd to ascribe hope or faith to God. He has knowledge, but neither hope nor faith. So if we speak of God as a person, he is extremely different from what we are. And in fact, since Cyril was so much insisting on the importance of artistic experience of God, yesterday Vittorio spoke about Dante. I think that one of the reasons why Dante's Divine Comedy is a greater literary and intellectual work than Milton's Paradise Lost is that in Dante, God himself does not appear. Only at the end he approaches him, but then he faints and doesn't introduce him as an individual person or figure. While the worst part of Paradise Lost is certainly the depiction of God. And let me end with a famous verse by Alexander Pope about God, about Milton's God, and God the Father turns a school divine. School divine means a professor of theology, and with all due respect to professors of theology, Cyril, I think it would be probably demeaning to God if we imagine him as a professor of theology, even with a longer white beard than you have.
Well, thank you very much for that tour de force. We've had a real feast this morning. If I could just make just a couple of comments. I was interested by the fact that that Schelling should play such a central role in Professor Regan's account, and particularly this notion of Schelling that had such an enormous impact on the Romantics of art being the true organon of philosophy, and so the overcoming of the concept or the purely conceptual approach through the image, the intuitive. I mean, interesting that I think the relationship to the Platonic tradition is complex there, because of course there are elements in Plotinus and his subordination of propositions to images in his discussion of the relationship between discursive reasoning and the noetic that interestingly mirror Schelling in 1800, although what is very different, of course, is that in Schelling, I think that early period is basically more Stoic than Platonic. I mean, the unity is totality rather than unity in this Platonic sense of a transcendent unity. Though even in Schelling, of course, that becomes more complicated in the later period. I would be a little bit, if I may say so, more cautious than you about the generalization about the Romantics. I was recently at Wheaton College, and at Wheaton College they have C.S. Lewis's library. And I was very interested to see this because I'd assumed from reading C.S. Lewis's work that the Romantics had had a huge influence on him, and a deeper influence than even he admits. And going into his library was very interesting. I could take out a copy of Byron's work, to which it said something like, read 1930 or whatever, never to be read again. And then, taking out his works of Coleridge, which was for me very interesting, seeing that there were marginalia, notes through them again. So, those would be extreme ends of a spectrum, where I would say that, obviously, Byron being a certain sort of atheistic romanticism, Coleridge with this deep interest in theology. He's the son of a clergyman. He's fascinated by, goes to Germany because of the Socinians, the Unitarians in England, and is obsessed throughout his career with the problems of the Christian doctrines, atonement, and the Trinity. So I think we do have to be slightly careful about the this term romanticism. And in fact, I was telling some friends that I saw recently an account of the Romantics where Peter Ackroyd was starting off with what I thought was an absurd caricature of the replacement of religion with the arts, which is, of course, understandable and has had a huge impact on our culture, but I don't think it's entirely the whole story. But thank you very much for your very rich paper. That's really just as it were a footnote. And to Professor Hösle, I was very, very fascinated by your account, which I found immensely helpful. And yes, I was particularly struck by the centrality of your account of Leibniz, who clearly, I mean, even the terminology of the monadology is there's a Platonic dimension there that is clear, and yet, as you say, he's so deeply a modern thinker and one of the great founders of the modern age. So thank you very much for that.
We have a little bit of time before they're ready for us for lunch for a couple of questions, and so we'll open it up for any questions or comments that you may have.
Mark Roach from German at Notre Dame. Well, thank you both for fascinating presentations. Vittorio, I have a question for you. I thought it very helpful that you tried to give us an account of why contemporary philosophers would no longer speak of participation, but that not all of the reservations are cogent. And one that intrigued me in particular was that the self-predication of ideas is appropriate in some cases. Did I understand you correctly that your view is that when there is a necessary self-contradiction, that it would, of course, be necessary, such as the concept of identity is both a concept and identical. To deny that would be to fall into a self-contradiction, and that in German idealism, or at least in Hegel, you have this as a necessary element of logical categories, but not in real philosophy. Is that your answer? Could you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, in Hegel, we have three parts of a system: logic, which is much, much broader than what we do today under logic, and of course, in the part dealing with syllogisms, completely out of date, because syllogisms are only one small part of what inference is about. But certainly, one of the depressing thing about the state of logic today is that logic has become only the doctrine of valid inference, while we do not have anymore a discipline that deals with the formation of concepts, the nature of concepts, while the traditional understanding of logic was that it was a doctrine of concepts, of propositions, and of inferences. And we have reduced it fundamentally to a doctrine of inference. While I do think that the question what concepts are is one of the most important questions of philosophers, and of course also the question how we get to true propositions, and obviously not everything can be, not all true propositions can be generated by inference, because every inference starts from presuppositions, from propositions that are presupposed. So in the Hegelian system, we have different types of concepts in the logic and in the real philosophy. And I do think that indeed one of the ways of distinguishing the two types of concept is that the concept that Hegel deals with in the logic can be predicated of themselves. For example, being is. Something is itself. The concept of something is itself something. Yeah? The concept of otherness is other to the concept of something, etc., etc. While in the Naturphilosophie or in the Geistphilosophie, this is no longer possible. Why? Because, for example, the concept of space is nothing spatial. The concept of time is nothing temporal. So here, self-predication would be absurd. There is a further differentiation mark because self-predication has nothing to do with the reflexivity as a trait of the concept. The concept of Hegel's philosophy of spirit referred to something which is reflexive. But the concept of spirit, according to Hegel, is nothing spiritual because the concepts belong to the logic. The concept is a logical category, not a spiritual, not a psychological category. The situation is even more complex in Hegel because Hegel recognizes also a psychological concept which is sharply demarcated from the logical concept. And it is the act by which we grasp the logical concept. Yeah? Something that happens in our mind when we grasp a logical concept. So he has a duality of both. But clearly, the concepts of philosophy of mind, as he develops them in the system, are logical concepts. But they refer to something which is reflexive, like the human mind. So that would be my answer to that. And all this in Plato is not yet very clearly elaborated. I mean, he has this enormous discovery of the problem of the universals. And since he was one of the greatest geniuses, if not the greatest genius ever, he plays in a very intelligent way with things. And he avoids a lot of the errors that his critics impute to him. But he doesn't have an elaborated doctrine of yet that, and it could not be expected. I mean, he had just discovered the problem.
Any other questions? Okay. The last word goes to Douglas.
Well, as I said earlier, I've learnt immensely from this session. It's been, for me, a real feast. So I'd just like to thank both of my... let me just, before I actually... There's one thing that I would want to mention, is that the question of the biblical to the philosophical God, that I think is one of the very fascinating questions that this notion of participation raises. And of course that's a complex issue even just historically. I mean, given the fact that the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible in Alexandria, so that when the church fathers are reading Exodus 3:14, they're reading in a terminology that for them will resonate with the language of being and becoming. So in a sense, when a Alexandrian church father reads of Moses being addressed by God as being ego eimi hoon, then as opposed to this realm of becoming, then those fathers will see scripture and the philosophical tradition in a much, obviously, closer sense than many modern critics would do. So I think the intertwining of whatever the biblical God is and the philosophical reflection about that is even hermeneutically a complex problem, not only metaphysically.
Well, just one comment, since you opened it up. I'm sure Vittorio can comment on it too. I mean, one thing has got to do so with what are the intermediating states, because we could sort of look sort of at universals in terms of instantiation, or at least you could imagine that might be the proper interpretation, and we're not really talking about a divine mind. But clearly in terms of assimilation, let's say sort of Middle Platonism, the Timaeus becomes sort of the text. In other words, that sort of will function as a hermeneutic clue, so with respect to Parmenides and Sophists and so forth. Therefore, you have a divine mind on board. And so the problem you could have is a problem sort of that you've at least ameliorated. So one of the things I suggested is that you have this amelioration of the problem, which then, of course, is further ameliorated sort of in Neoplatonism itself. And therefore, once you have noesis and the noema in terms of that which is the object of knowledge, you can sort of at a certain level, but not at the ultimate level, penultimate level, sort of, you can, this sort of is at least an ersatz sort of, of the biblical God, because you've got that sort of which is known, and you've got that sort of, which is knowing. So these are intervening sort of stages in and through which assimilation occurs. At the same time, sort of, even though sort of we have these forms of assimilation, there still seems sort of, which are not sort of joints, sort of, which are not sort of, kind of absolutely sort of, rendered seamless in ways. And therefore, what can happen is, even sort of when you have what looks like a synthesis, the synthesis itself sort of, seems sort of to somehow rather sort of have sort of edges shown. So we have a knower and a known, but the knower and the known can turn out to be sort of at a particular level such that then that which follows from that, I mean, that could be a divine activity, but the world itself sort of, as that world is invested or participates and so forth, you won't have the same sense of anything like possibility. Leave aside sort of possible worlds. God did not need to create the world sort of, in the biblical frame. And therefore, in that sense, any world was only possible in any event. It was not necessary, at least. It was not sort of a part and parcel, let's say, analytical definition of God, that God would have a world and God would have any particular world. But there is a world, and it's this world rather than some other world. Whereas in Neoplatonism, by and large, you're not going to have sort of possibility in that sense. You may not have logical necessity. It may be its aesthetic necessity, what might sort of translate as your moral necessity. So these sort of come together, but they're always ready to be unhinged. And the point is that after the medieval synthesis, what is possibly unhingeable gets unhinged. There are recollections of putting it back together. Obviously, Aristotelianism doesn't die, Thomism doesn't die. Platonism makes a kind of huge rebound at the end of the 15th century and the 16th century and so forth. But they're playing catch-up. There's something has happened whereby sort of there's been this unhinging. I started talking about Kant sort of as a further line of the unhinging, then setting sort of the table as to what participation is going to look like philosophically, how we're going to assert it, given sort of that it looks like now it can no longer function as a natural default. And then I wanted to tell a somewhat cheeky story, because I didn't want to talk about Hegel, who is the last hurrah, I think, with respect to it. That, well, you either then continue philosophically, and you talk sort of as Hegel does and as has been rendered by Vittorio, or you think so the game is up philosophically, but participation sort of can have another turn. And then the question sort of is where sort of is going to have another turn. I would like to have spoken about Heidegger, because Heidegger gives you a very complex, I think, form of this particular question. That he's neither philosopher sort of nor poet, or he's poet-philosopher. There's participation which isn't quite participation, a very, very interesting and heady mix, which again is rebutted. I rebutted by semantics, rebutted sort of by semiotics and so forth. But German idealism sort of is, if you like, that ending, or the sense of an ending, that if we're going to have it, it has to look like this. And whereby I think so that I want to make one final comment on your Leibniz. What you said so that it's a pity German idealism didn't take sort of Leibniz more seriously. I think they took him incredibly seriously and rejected him, and accepted Spinoza instead. That is, they denied possibility because the view was there had to be one-to-one correspondence between the world sort of, and God. And the criterions of the absolute criterion with respect to that is possibility. There is no such thing as possibility. God sort of possibilizes or actualizes all that God is in the world. So I don't think it was an accident that somehow or other they had an off moment whereby sort of decided, oh well, Leibniz is good, but we'll say something different. I think you could actually say that the valorization of a very different Spinoza than the one that's rejected, the valorization is active, absolutely active and generative of German idealism, and Spinoza, the ghost of Spinoza comes back and defeats Leibniz. It's not merely that there are no possible worlds, there cannot be any possible worlds, given sort of their particular view of what sort of participation and totality has to look like.
Can I answer to it?
Oh, absolutely.
We're off
Well,
time. No, we're out of time.
No, actually, I think
1 minute and a half.
Could be good to answer.
1 minute and a half. So the interesting thing is indeed the enormous reception of Spinoza that happens in German culture in the second half of the 18th century. And it is true that people begin to prefer Spinoza to Leibniz. The problem, however, is that the Spinoza they are upholding is a Leibnizian Spinoza. They don't really understand it. Already Lessing, the central idea of the Erziehung des Menschengeschlechts is a teleology in development. And all the ugly sides of Spinoza, for example, his absolutely brutal doctrine of international law, where he explicitly says might is right, there is no other criterion, all this is absent. The ugly sides of his doctrine of affects is completely absent, and it's in absolute contradiction with Kant's ethics and German idealism. If there is something to which we are committed, it's Kant's revolution in ethics, which is as anti-Spinozan as you can imagine. So the Spinoza they uphold is a teleological Spinoza, and a Spinoza that is a moral realist, which is quite in strident contradiction to what Spinoza says. Now, why did they not go to Leibniz? Well, I think the reason is very simple. Leibniz was, there's this book that I don't like, The Courtier and the Heretic, about Leibniz and Spinoza. Leibniz was a person who was very ambitious. Even if he was a Lutheran, he almost got a cardinal's hat because he was offered the direction of a Vatican library when he was in Rome. He was a person who was at the end in the service of a Russian Tsar, of an Austrian emperor, and of a king of Prussia. He was one of the wealthiest person when he died. And he was the symptom of a person who is integrated into society. And this was unacceptable with the feeling of revolt against the strictures of German culture in the 18th century. And Spinoza was the hero. He was a person who lived by working on his lenses. He was the person who had criticized historical Christianity very sharply, had developed modern hermeneutics. Leibniz, in fact, is not very far from Spinoza when he speaks about biblical hermeneutics. But he says it in such a way that the bishops who read him could nod their head and says, yes, he's a smart guy, what he says. He's much closer in many aspects to Spinoza than it seems. But the generation of the Germans in the 1770s simply identified Leibniz with the servant of the princes and of the bishops. Therefore, I think they go back to Spinoza. With regard to the logic of Leibniz, they simply, here I would insist, they were not up to it because the great logical works of Leibniz were only published in 1900 by Cultura. They could not know them. What was published at the end of the 18th century of Leibniz was very little. The Theology, the Nouveaux Essais, that had a strong impact on Kant's critique of pure reason, no doubt, and several of the minor works. But it was a minuscule part. And I would say the most interesting logical foundations were not accessible to the German idealists, not through their fault, they simply had not been edited.
Quick comment. Stipulate sort of that it is sort of a Leibnizian Spinoza, granted. Second, it doesn't actually still meet the point. That is that they certainly knew sort of about the notion of possible world. And therefore sort of that the world that we have sort of is an instance of sort of worlding sort of and there are other possible ones. That's rejected. In other words, whatever sort of whatever the status of the logic, that sort of there sort of is an option. Clearly know that. And it's rejected. And therefore, whatever else about Spinoza gets modified. It gets modified by sort of the third critique of Kant, among other things. So that's where teleology sort of comes back in, sort of now it's made constitutive rather than heuristic. But with respect sort of to the fundamental option is there a one-to-one correspondence between the world and therefore God's power to express? Or is there not? That is, could God have expressed sort of no world in a different way in another world? That sort of is the moment of decision. And with respect to that narrow but absolutely fundamental point, Spinoza is chosen over Leibniz.
Douglas, you get the last word.
Well, I think, as I say, we've had a feast of metaphysics this morning. It remains for me just to thank both of our speakers for what an exciting time, and to thank both now.
Thank you.
On behalf of the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced, on behalf of our institute, I'd like to thank our presenters this morning, and also to let you know that lunch is being served in the lower level of this hall, McKenna Hall. They're ready for us now if you'd like to go down. Our next session convenes at 3 o'clock.